She stood at the edge of her own wedding feast and no one looked at her. The laughter rose in golden waves around the long candle-lit hall, guests lifting their glasses to toast a union that already felt hollow. Evelina Ashford, now the Duchess of Thornwood, held her untouched champagne and watched her husband's broad back across the room. Alexander Thornwood, the Duke, stood in a circle of politicians, his profile all sharp angles and cold purpose. He had not glanced at her once since they entered the hall. The lace of her sleeve trembled, and she pressed her fingers flat against the stem of the glass to still them. Somewhere a violinist played a waltz she was not invited to dance to. This was the beginning of everything she had hoped for, and none of it was meant for her. 3 months earlier she had been sitting in her father's dusty library, staring at a letter from a man whose name made her stomach tighten. Lord Percival Blackwood, rich, twice her age, a baron with iron fists and a reputation for cruelty hidden behind silken manners, had offered to settle her family's crushing debts in exchange for her hand. Her father wept when he gave her the letter. Evelina did not weep. She folded the paper, walked to the window and watched the last light die over the Baron Ashford estate, wondering if a life extinguished slowly was any different from a life that never truly began. 2 days later another letter arrived, this one from the Duke of Thornwood. Cold, formal, direct. He proposed a marriage of convenience. No sentiment, no false promises. In return for her family's lands, which bordered his own, he would liquidate every debt, provide her father a comfortable annuity, and grant her the protection of his name. She accepted because Blackwood's shadow was already darkening the doorstep. She accepted because a cold duke felt safer than a cruel one. She did not know then that safety without warmth was just another kind of winter. The wedding was small and swift. Alexander spoke his vows with perfect courtesy and no feeling. At the altar his gray eyes touched her face only for a moment, like a stranger reading a plaque on a statue, then moved on. That night he showed her to a beautiful suite of rooms in Thornwood Hall and told her she would want for nothing. He did not visit her, not that night, not any night after. At first Evelina told herself it was shyness, the reserve of a powerful man unaccustomed to intimacy. She woke early each morning determined to be a wife he could grow fond of. She learned the names of all the servants. She ordered his favorite figs placed on the breakfast table. She arranged fresh flowers in the corridors because the great house felt too silent, too heavy with old velvet and older shadows. When she passed him in the gallery she offered a gentle smile, a soft word, hopping for a crack in the stone. The crack never came. The first time hope fractured publicly was at Lord and Lady Stapleton's autumn ball, a month after the wedding. Evelina stood beside Alexander while society measured her. Whispers curled around her like smoke. "The Baron's daughter," they murmured. "Penniless. Quite lovely in a quiet way, but can you imagine?" She kept her shoulders straight. Then Lady Cordelia Vance swept into the room in a gown of midnight blue, and the whispers changed direction. Tall, golden, impeccably connected, Lady Cordelia had been linked to the Duke in rumor for 2 seasons. Evelina knew this because the maids talked. Now she watched Alexander cross the floor without a second thought, offer Cordelia his arm and lead her into the first waltz. Evelina stood alone near the champagne fountain, a fixed smile on her face, while cordial ladies asked her where she bought her gloves and why she was not dancing. She answered with grace. Inside, something small and brittle cracked. She was not jealous of Cordelia's beauty. She was jealous that Alexander looked at the woman at all. He never looked at her. She stopped arranging figs. When she realized he never ate them, she replaced them with simple seasonal fruit for her own tray. It was a tiny surrender, but it shifted something inside her. If he would not notice her efforts, she would stop making them invisible. She began walking the estate grounds alone, sketching landscapes with charcoal sticks she borrowed from the steward's office. The hills beyond the formal gardens were wild with heather and gorse. There the wind felt honest, and the silence did not feel like rejection. She started bringing small bags of bread and cheese to the tenant children who gathered at the edge of the wood. Their grateful laughter warmed her far more than any dinner conversation with a husband who answered in single syllables. Slowly, without announcing it, she stopped waiting for him to turn his head. She built a quiet life in the spaces he did not occupy. The Duke noticed her absence before he noticed her. At first he registered it as a relief. The house had felt strangely unsettled with her soft footsteps and hopeful questions. When the corridors fell still again, he assumed she had finally accepted the terms of their arrangement and occupied herself accordingly. But then one evening he walked past the small salon where she used to sit with her embroidery and found it empty. The fire was unlit. Her embroidery hoop lay in a drawer, untouched. The next morning at breakfast, her chair remained vacant. He learned from a footman that Her Grace had taken a basket to the village. She did not return until late afternoon, her hair wind-tousled, her cheeks pink from the cold. She passed him in the hallway with a polite nod and no lingering look. He found himself standing in place several seconds after she had gone, unsettled by something he could not name. Lord Henry Ashton arrived in November, a distant cousin of the Duke and the only person who ever teased him without flinching. Henry was warm where Alexander was frost, quick to laugh, easy with compliments. At dinner he listened to Evelina describe the new drainage system she was organizing for the lower fields, a project she had undertaken after visiting sick tenants in damp cottages. Henry leaned forward with genuine interest. "Do you mean to say you drafted the maps yourself, Your Grace?" "That is remarkable." Evelina smiled, a real smile, the kind that softened the corners of her mouth and made her eyes light from within. Alexander watched the exchange from the head of the table and felt a foreign twist in his chest, sharp and immediate. He set down his fork too hard. The sound made Evelina glance at him. He arranged his face into perfect neutrality and said nothing. The twist did not fade. Jealousy arrived without permission. Alexander began to notice the details he had ignored for months. The way the morning light caught the auburn strands in Evelina's hair when she sat near the window with her sketchbook. The steady patience in her voice when she taught a tenant boy his letters. The fact that she no longer paused outside his study door, hopping to speak with him. She walked past it now as though it were just another room. He found himself wanting her to pause. That wanting frightened him more than any political adversary. He had been raised by a father who regarded emotion as a leak in a ship, something to be plugged before it sank a man. His mother had died when he was 7, and the old Duke had never spoken her name again. Love, Alexander had learned young, was a dangerous thing to carry. Better to keep your hands free. Yet lately his hands felt empty. One afternoon he saw Evelina and Henry walking together in the rose garden, her arm tucked loosely through his cousin's, her laugh floating up like music. Henry was showing her a letter, something amusing, and she leaned closer to read it. The Duke stopped beneath the stone archway and felt the cold bloom of a new understanding. He was not indifferent. He had never been indifferent. He had buried the truth so deep he had mistaken the absence of pain for the absence of feeling. Now it surfaced with a vengeance. He turned sharply and walked to his study, where he sat staring at the account ledgers without seeing a single number. That evening he was unusually curt with Henry, who only raised an eyebrow and later told Evelina, with a knowing look, that his cousin seemed to have swallowed a wasp. Evelina did not laugh. She had stopped guessing at Alexander's moods weeks ago. The distance between them took on a different quality. Before, it had been his creation. Now she maintained it. She was never unkind, never rude, but the eager bride who once lingered hopefully outside his door had vanished. In her place stood a composed young woman with her own schedule, her own quiet confidence, her own sorrows neatly folded away. She began accepting invitations without him, visiting neighbors, attending charity committees. At first society whispered that the new Duchess was being neglected. Then they noticed her intelligent conversation, her gentle dignity, and the whispers softened into admiration. When she organized a winter clothing drive for the orphanage, Lady Stapleton publicly praised her. Alexander read the notice in the newspaper and realized his wife was becoming beloved by people who saw her more often than he did. The pride he felt was tangled with panic. He was losing a woman he had never truly had. The hidden truth emerged on a frozen December night. Evelina had returned late from a tenant meeting and, chilled to the bone, took a shortcut through the Duke's private study to reach the library fire. She rarely entered his sanctum. Tonight the door was ajar and a single lamp burned low. On the desk lay a leather folder she had never seen before, stuffed with correspondence tied in blue ribbon. A loose paper had slipped free and a name caught her eye, Lord Percival Blackwood. Her blood stilled. She should have walked away. Instead, she lifted the paper with numb fingers and read words that rearranged the architecture of her world. The letter was in Alexander's hand, a draft unsent. It detailed his investigation into Blackwood's unsavory business dealings and his written pledge to ensure that the Lady Evelina Ashford shall never be exposed to that man's reach, regardless of the cost to my own reputation. Another paper was a copy of a promissory note from 2 years earlier, before she had ever met the Duke, in which Alexander secretly purchased a large portion of Ashford debt from a predatory lender. He had been protecting her family long before the marriage proposal. He had stepped forward not for the land, not for convenience, but because he had known about Blackwood's threat and had chosen to become her shield without ever claiming the role. She sank into his chair, the papers trembling in her hands. The husband who never looked at her had been the architect of her freedom, and he had never said a word. The door opened. She looked up through a glaze of tears and saw Alexander frozen on the threshold, his face draining of color. He saw the folder, the open letter, her expression. Something raw and unguarded flickered in his eyes before the mask slammed down. "You were not meant to see those," he said, his voice low. Evelina rose, still holding the paper. "You saved me from him. 2 years ago you started saving me. Why didn't you tell me?" He did not answer. He moved to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid. "It was a matter of honor. You owed me nothing in return." She walked toward him, not touching but close enough to see the tension in his jaw. "You gave me your name, your wealth, your protection, and you gave me nothing else. I thought you found me a burden. I thought I was invisible to you." He flinched. "I wanted you to be invisible," he said, the words rough. "I wanted to feel nothing, because feeling anything felt like a risk I could not afford." He turned then, and she saw the full weight of his long-suppressed torment. The cold Duke was not cold at all. He was terrified, and she had spent months bleeding quietly while he wrestled with a fear he could not name. The confession in the study was not gentle. It was 2 exhausted souls finally lowering weapons neither knew they carried. Alexander spoke in halting sentences about his father, about the lesson that love was a destructive force that unmoored even the greatest men, about waking up every morning beside the memory of a wife who was present and still impossibly far away because he had no map for closeness. He told her that he had watched her light diminish day by day and hated himself for causing it, yet could not make his feet move toward her because every step felt like a surrender of the control he clung to. Evelina listened, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She did not forgive him instantly. Pain had its own rhythm, but she understood him in a way that rearranged her bitterness into something softer. "I was not invisible because I had no worth," she said softly. "I was invisible because you were afraid to look. That is not my burden to carry anymore." He reached out, hesitating, and for the first time his hand found hers. It was not a grand romantic gesture. It was a man learning to cross a chasm 1 inch at a time. They stood together in the lamplight, 2 figures carved from old grief and new hope. The days that followed were not a sudden bloom of passion. They were careful, tentative, like new shoots pushing through frost. Alexander did not become a poet overnight. He still struggled to voice his feelings, but he started showing them in ways she could see. He began joining her for breakfast, not because he was hungry but because he wanted the quiet company of her across the table. He asked her about the drainage project and actually listened to her answer, even asked a follow-up question about irrigation. He left a new set of charcoal pencils on her sketching desk without a note. When he saw her teaching a tenant boy numbers in the library, he stood in the doorway with an expression that could only be called wonder. She caught his eye and smiled, and he smiled back, a real smile that softened the hard lines around his mouth. It was the first real smile she had ever received from him, and it made her heart ache with a sweetness that felt like healing. The fear of loss surfaced during a sudden storm in January, when a riding accident on the icy roads left Alexander with a broken arm and a gash on his head. Evelina did not leave his bedside for 2 days. She fed him broth, read to him, and when he woke feverish in the night she held his good hand and whispered that she was there, that she would always be there. He surfaced from the fever to find her asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still wrapped around his, and he felt the last wall inside him crumble. He had spent his life bracing for loss, and in doing so he had almost lost the one person who made loss unbearable. When he was well enough to sit up, he asked her to sit closer. He told her about his mother, about the hollow echo in the halls after she died, about the terrifying emptiness of a love that ends. Evelina listened, and then she said, "Love does not disappear just because someone leaves. It stays in the walls, it stays in us. Your mother's love is still here, and mine is not going anywhere." He pressed her fingers to his lips and closed his eyes. The silence between them was no longer distance. It was rest. The turning point for the outside world came in early spring, when the Thornwood Charity Garden Party drew half the county. Evelina organized it with quiet efficiency, and Alexander stood beside her as guests arrived. Lady Cordelia attended, still gracious, but now the Duke's attention never strayed far from his wife. When a visiting baron made a condescending remark about Evelina's humble origins, Alexander's voice cut cold and clear across the gathering. "The Duchess of Thornwood has elevated this estate and every life upon it with her character and her wisdom. I will not have her spoken of with anything less than the respect she commands." The baron stammered an apology. Evelina looked at Alexander with surprise, and he met her gaze with steady reassurance. The guests saw it. The servants saw it. The narrative shifted. The Duke who once ignored his wife now publicly defended her. The Duchess who once faded into the wallpaper now stood in full light, confident and serene. Henry Ashton, who had been a dear friend throughout the winter, toasted them at the luncheon. To a partnership that proves the strongest foundations are often the slowest built. Evelina squeezed Alexander's hand under the table. He squeezed back. On a gentle evening in May, they walked together through the wild heather fields she had once sketched alone. The sunset painted the sky in coral and gold. Alexander paused, looking at her with an intensity that no longer frightened her. "I spent years believing love was a threat," he said. "And then I spent months believing I had lost the chance to learn it. Every morning you were further away, and I knew I was the reason. I have never been so afraid in my life." Evelina lifted her hand to his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin. "I stopped waiting," she said, "but I never stopped loving you, even when it hurt, even when I thought it was hopeless. Some part of me always hoped you would find your way back." He pulled her gently into his arms and held her as the wind swept the hillside. Not a desperate embrace, not a dramatic declaration, just two people who had walked through separate deserts and finally reached the same spring. The pain that had defined their beginning was no longer the center of the story. It was the soil from which a quieter, deeper love had grown. In the months that followed, Thornwood Hall transformed. The heavy drapes were pulled back to let in sun. Laughter rang in corridors that had known only echoes. Evelina's sketches lined the walls, scenes of village life and rolling moors, and Alexander commissioned a proper art tutor for her, not because she needed instruction, but because he wanted to give her every tool for joy. She continued her charitable work, now with her husband's active support, and together they built a school for tenant children on the estate's southern edge. People who once pitied the Duchess now envied the deep, steady partnership the Duke and Duchess shared. And at night, when the house was quiet, Alexander would find Evelina in the library and sit beside her, reading his reports while she sketched, their shoulders brushing. The silence was full of trust. It was the silence of two people who had stopped running. One evening he set down his papers and looked at her for a long moment. "I will never be able to give you back those months," he said quietly. "The months I made you feel invisible." Evelina put down her charcoal and met his eyes. "You gave me something else instead," she replied. "You gave me the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. You gave me the chance to see you as you are, not as the man I imagined. And you gave me a love that is not fragile. It broke and it was rebuilt." That makes it stronger than anything that never suffered. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that spoke more than any grand speech. She closed her eyes and let the feeling settle deep in her bones. The story that began with a bride alone at her own feast ended here, in a room full of quiet affection, two hearts that had learned to beat in the same rhythm after being out of sync for so long. Outside the window, the Thornwood land stretched peaceful under a rising moon, and inside, the last remnants of old grief slowly melted away. They had found each other not through perfection, but through the patient, aching, beautiful process of healing. And that was more than enough.